it remains to be seen how much, you know, the tussle between the, tech bro right and the Bannonite right is going to resolve itself.
Yeah. I think so. This is like a really fascinating moment in like what comes after neoliberalism, right? And I'm in agreement. I mean, you know, I know we on BungaCast have been pushing this point about kind of the tentative moves beyond neoliberalism for quite a while, and actually it's taken until now. It seemed like it was going to happen in the first Trump term. It didn't entirely. Johnson in the UK seemed to be leading to something else there as well. And then you got a in part through the pandemic, uh, a kind of revanche of the liberal technocracy, which kind of extended neoliberalism for a while, and now we're properly moving beyond it. Now, I'm in agreement with like Branko Milanovic, who points out the kind of aspects of it which are continuous and not, and so there's discontinuities in terms of the end of globalization, trade tariffs, et cetera, et cetera. But it's not a complete disjuncture. And I think, it's important to say that anybody who thought that post neoliberalism or something that wasn't neoliberal meant a return to social democracy were always wrong. And that was never going to be the case, that those are not the only two options on the table. And there will never, ever be social democracy again. And I mean, I say this as a Marxist and someone who would prefer to live under a social democratic regime. But the historical conditions of that were so particular. That's not coming back. I mean, that doesn't mean that there isn't going to be reformism of some sort in capitalism again, but there's certainly not going to be social democracy as we knew it. But anyway, so what we actually get, kind of tracing this forward, is like this very hybrid sort of thing where you get market liberalization in some forms, right? You get more deregulation under Trump. You get a, a strengthening and deepening of the speculative economy in terms of both in terms of financial speculation, but particularly cryptocurrency and gaming and all those other aspects of it, that everything becomes kind of subject to speculation, securitization, etc. And at the same time, you get kind of national boundaries put up in a way which goes completely contrary to a kind of Hayekian vision, and indeed to the kind of actually existing neoliberal visions of the 1990s. And so that's kind of weird, because I think a lot of people will be like, well, no, it's still the same old world. But I think it's kind of worth pointing out how things are, how things are new, and the immigration thing is a good example of that as well. Those tensions get played out pretty clearly, and in fact, actually saying it, Bannon and Musk, if you want to kind of personalize these things, well, maybe the post neoliberal era is Bannon and Musk. What is Bannon and Musk? That's a weird mix, right? But the
Yeah.
in practice, politics is often kind of confused, and even the peak neoliberalism of the 1990s was itself not the didn't follow exactly the precepts of kind of neoliberal thought, right? So
Yeah.
post neoliberalism in
Well, it
practice
depended
is
on the
also weird.
strong state. Yeah,
Yeah,
it
well,
was sold as libertarianism, but it had needed a very strong state to function.
yeah,
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 that's a kind of shift I'm seeing away from this kind of more sort of humane classical liberal Cato Institute thing, and now it's just sort of it's still pro market, but within a context of yeah, making America great again, a strong state. It sort of celebrates the person on the ground a little less than it used to. I don't hear things like small business is the backbone of America anymore. There's like this settling into acceptance of new great men theory or something, right? Like, and Musk is that
right.
person. And
Well, but the hyper-competitive society is a crucial part of this, right?
yeah,
I mean, particularly in the periphery of capitalism, I think it's even more present. I see it very much in Brazil. But I think I'm curious what your read on this is in the U.S., because I've had arguments about this back and forth, and I haven't made my mind up. But there is the hyper-competitive society. The hyper-competitive society, it has its ideological component and like form of legitimation through saying, you're a little guy, if you go there and you invest a little bit in Bitcoin, make a little bit of money, save money, and buy Bitcoin, you'll make it rich or whatever, right? So there's all these quick, it's certainly not the Protestant ethic of saving and building your own business, right? It's and
right.
commitment to work and discipline, etc. It's the speculative ethic, and that's quite clear. But at the same time, as you say, there's not the kind of OG neoliberal talking up of the small business owner,
Yeah,
right?
I
So I'm not. So what is
I
it?
think of like Milton Friedman. He had this like PBS documentary. I think in the very late '70s, based on his book Free to Choose. And he was in. It showed him in China and in the U.S. and just at ports and things like that. He's all the freedom to choose is just you and me, people going about their business, trading, building wealth. It doesn't. That seems too like hunky dory now. I mean, I see this kind of viciousness on the younger right who still like markets, just thinking as the typical person is just, I've heard the term biomatter thrown around, just excess biomatter. It's just really dehumanizing.
Jesus.
It's a weird kind of a Randianism now that is not, I was never a social democrat or anything, but there's a certain humanity to my sort of, small man, liberal capitalist attitude. And I see that being I see that dissolving, you know.
I think it's very like cyberpunk feudalism, right? So
Yeah,
it's
some
all
of these
about
guys
like
like it. The accelerationists tend to actually like that.
yeah, they want like the various big people who will only pass on their wealth probably through inheritance as the elite, and then they're orbited by like their courtiers, right? And it's all about like personal loyalty to the boss within the structure of like under the king. It's like it is very feudal. It's very weird, but it's also unlike feudalism. It is tied to a strong state, and so we're seeing almost like the opposite of what Benjamin Barber probably would have wanted, which is a kind of a kind of neoliberal, but it's neoliberal economically, but like very, very nationalist state, like neoliberal nationalism with the structure of a neo-feudal order. It's so bizarre, but it's not surprising because I've been kind of noticing this trend from Silicon Valley for like a really long time, since like the early 2010s. And I've always called them like the techno feudalists and stuff like that. And this was true when they were super woke. This was true when they were like edgy fire shirt Guy Fieri people. Before that, like no matter what guys they've had, I've always seen them as like this techno feudal thing. And frankly, I just think it's very unstable and it will be unpopular the more people are exposed to it.
Well, so yeah, this is the thing. Like, I mean, my reservations about techno feudalism aside, like the basically climbing over each other, right, to get the bag, which is basically the social vision that's there, departs from classical neoliberals and ordo liberals insofar as it doesn't really present a vision of social order in any way, right? It's not the market providing some sort of kind of harmonious, albeit unequal, kind of order. It's quite chaotic. It's quite anarchic. But at the same time, with a kind of strong state, with these various kind of shifting forms of tribal alliances, and you get the kind of you get your hyper modern tribalism. That here I think Barber was right to identify this. You get the kind of hyper modern tribalism, whether it's liberal identity politics or white nativism or whatever else it might be that gets thrown up, as well as you get your more kind of traditional tribalisms, which of course themselves are not traditional, in the global periphery. So yeah, I don't know. I think you're right. It's like a kind of confused amalgam, and I don't know how legitimate that sort of vision will be. I think that because the problem with that hyper competitive vision is people get tired, and I think there's a lot of like I wrote a thing last year about kind of exhaustion and symbols of kind of indices of just people wanting a bit of a quiet life and just being tired of the hyper politics, being tired of hyper modernity, of the constant notifications of the da 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 da, right? And constant demands to be productive, to get the bag, da da da. So I think these are things which are very much in obvious opposition, and really in tension. I think probably within a lot of subjects, within people, not just between different types of people. And it's not clear what wins out, but I do think that there's a lot of indices of kind of a politics, which is just like, can I just maybe giving up, bowing out? And some people might interpret that in a more politicized form, right? The kind of quiet quitting. Oh, that's kind of somehow radical or socialist, which it isn't at all.
What the
But
Chinese call a lying flat.
exactly, the lying flat thing. Yeah. And I think these are kind of pathologies of hyper modernity, because it isn't an attempt to kind of seek political or social change, but a kind of individualistic withdrawal. And I think, maybe that's the way that this kind of hyper competitive Bannon plus Musk new order functions,
Yeah.
that people, that the way it can trundle along is that it feeds off the enthusiasm of those who want to go after and get the bag, but also the escape valve is, I give up, whatever, I will make do with less and just carry on that way.
Yeah, the young right now, it's amazing how speaking of, the Calvinist work ethic and all that, they don't believe that. They have their own, like, you gotta take what you can get right now, which would have seemed more like a kind of hippie ethos, but with, not like something. It's what's sort of nihilist tinged, and it seems to want to play crypto like the lottery and expect that to make you wealthy. That's the only way out, unless you were, fortunate enough to have gotten a computer science degree and have gone right to college out of high school. And, those are the people who are in the really good secure position. But for everyone else, you've got to, try your hand at crypto and stuff like that. The Wall Street bets style, Wild West speculation they think is their only way out. Um, but, someone like Bannon actually represents, he doesn't speak the language of some kind of egalitarian leftist, but hidden in his messages are, a they desire for a greater sense of security for regular Americans. So I would put him on the more humane side, as much as, people want to paint him as something like a demon. And the jovial tech bros are a little more villainous in my mind. Um,
Absolutely, yeah.
so
I
yes, yeah, go ahead, Christopher.
No, I agree. I actually think that there's probably slightly more commonality between Steve Bannon and Elizabeth Warren than there are with many people in the Republican Party. And I'm a person who's so checked out and has been for a long time, so checked out of the two-party system or anything or conventional definitions of left and right. I don't even care. Just get me something that delivers better for average people and maybe is less subservient to corporations, and I'll back whoever you are, no matter what your weird fan base or ideological statement is. And I think that there's an element of pragmatism will have to grow around people in kind of these declining developed societies all over the world, of just ignoring this kind of like trendy kick the football back and forth between two parties or whatever, and just look at like, okay, what weird coalition, no matter how weird or temporary it might be, what's it going to get you? Like, is it going to get you something? Like, this is going to be how people are going to mind things. I think actually Trump's second, or I guess third presidential campaign, that he won this last time, was actually kind of good at that. It was like good at appealing to independent voters, which is why he made gains with everyone except for people who had postgraduate degrees. So it's I think there's a desire to look for just like, who cares what something's even labeled as? Can you give me something? But meanwhile, also at the same time, there are people, mostly culture warriors, grievance-based people, all across the spectrum, mostly on the far wings. Like, I talk shit about the center, so now it's time to criticize the wings. Who I think will never adopt pragmatism, because it's all about pursuing grievance and virtue signaling for them, and they'll be like the diehard warriors for like the old alliance system. But I think more and more people are going to look beyond that and look for just like, well, who am I going to align with on one issue today, and I might change my alliance tomorrow.
And that doesn't need to be moderate, right? It doesn't need to be. It doesn't imply any necessary moderation. You might actually have quite, for today's times, radical policies, but that they're just on different bits of the spectrum relative to where the way things have been aligned for the past 30 years. And I think that might be a good. That's probably a good thing, because
Yes.
as much as I would defend kind of anybody who says they're beyond left and right, I'm always skeptical of. But at the same time, it has reached a stage where left and right don't exist as kind of real coherent things in the world. And to a certain extent, they're categories which obscure really understanding what's going on. Or certainly, if that's where you end your political analysis, you're missing out pretty much
Yeah,
everything else,
I
right?
think I think when you've reached the point where class reductionist is some kind of smear targeting the right, then we're in confused times, there's a guy named Dave the Distributist, Dave Green. He's on X and elsewhere, Substack, and he claims that it's the right now most enthusiastic about talking about class. I don't know about that. They are certainly into using the term PMC. The word class is involved in that, but I think for them that's more of a kind of a shorthand for feminized corporate world and emphasis on the feminized. So they're, but they are willing to speak more bluntly about class in a way that they didn't to speak in any way in that sense. And
Well,
I, I
the
see Williams
the
pointed
left
out too.
also
Yeah.
the left has also, very often talked about class, but also not in a Marxist sense either, right? It's often talked about class in a moralized sense. So, I mean, there's lots of you can talk about class, but you can also talk about class in a lot of bad and wrong ways. And
Well,
the right
in
does
this
it.
case,
The right certainly does
as
it,
a
but the left
proxy
does it too.
for annoying HR lady. Really, that's kind of what
Right?
if
Yeah.
you just see right through it. That's really what they mean. And so yeah, but yeah, everything is being sort of upended now. Um, some of the we're talking about the center and the passionless, decrepit center that is being beaten down in the 21st century, at least on a rhetorical level, and kind of
They are
enthusiastically.
passionate about one thing. I do
What?
want to point that out. There's one thing that they're very passionate about, aside
Oh,
from like
COVID.
being like kowtowed to as rational people who attend the cocktail party and know all the right people and don't think anything that's too disturbing looking. No, they have one true ideological commitment, and that is endless war. That is their true love. Is an endless, globalized, low intensity conflict that they can say like, look what we're doing, we're spreading our greater market political system everywhere, we are stewards of the liberal international order. That's the one thing they truly love.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
I would imagine that does have the most continuity. That is, people, criticize deep state terminology, but that has been the most shielded from democratic input. I mean, just
Yes.
by design. And so that would probably
Mhm.
be the last domino to fall, right? If any, that makes sense.
Well, it's funny. So I remembered. I think I probably read to return to Jihad versus McWorld. I probably read that book on the back of Zizek discussing it. So I went to look that up because I was trying to remember what Zizek had said, and he made the point that well, Jihad and McWorld are two sides of the same coin, etc., which is Barber's point as well, but that advocates of religion start by or advocates of fundamentalism or effectively the advocates of jihad in Barber's term start by attacking secular culture and whatever, but end up forsaking any real meaningful religious experience in doing so. And the same happens with liberals, where they start off by attacking anti-democratic authoritarian fundamentalism and end up giving up on freedom and democracy so that they can really hit the terrorists, right, with war. And he was right, and he wrote that back in 2003 or four or something. And it's the point remains and becomes ever truer as the rest of liberals supposedly liberal commitments fall away, or not supposedly liberal, genuinely
Yeah,
liberal commitments fall away.
doesn't say much for the idea that principles are really at work in politics. And it's really, maybe reductive. Whom you have a certain vision of the people you feel warm toward, or people you feel cold toward, and whatever arrangement gets you to boosting your allies and punishing your friends, you know, just use it. But and for the time being, you can still speak in terms of liberal principles to do it. But in the late 2010s, there was a trend on the left to not even speak in those terms anymore. So wokeness, and now it's pulled back. But in other words, so even rhetorically, they're starting to just ditch some of the liberal niceties. Um,
Yeah,
but
it's just Schmittianism at the end of the day.
yeah,
That's just
Yeah.
friend enemy, and that's where that's a cynicism, a deep cynicism, I think, of contemporary politics. I wanted to add one other thing about
yeah,
the
it
just
can't be the
about
end. It can't just be Schmittian. I don't believe that. But go ahead.
no, exactly. Yeah, and the Schmittianism was a good corrective to post politics of like, well, it's all consensus, it's just technical implementation. We all agree on the fundamental precepts of liberalism and democracy and McDonald's or whatever it is. You might pick more up to date, up to date cultural symbols, but that we're all basically in agreement. And the Schmittianism was saying, no, politics is about friend and enemy, but it's not only that, right? But what's interesting is like thinking about the jihad, and what Barber tried to capture with jihad, which is fundamentalism, it's tribalism, various other things maybe as well. Um, but I think what he misses out is just crime and corruption, right? And proliferation of criminal groups which challenge state sovereignty. That in a lot of the world, it's not these kind of ideological or ideologically coded tribalists, right? It's not kind of whatever, to use a terrible caricature, like men with kind of funny headdresses shouting in a foreign language, right? Which supposedly indicates some deep and fundamental belief, belief that us postmodern Westerns aren't able to really have in our hearts, but these people really believe, and they'll kill people for it. It's like a lot of it is just the pure cynicism of, get the bag, but in criminal markets, because there isn't enough of a legitimate market to absorb all the labor and desires and interests that people have. And so, if I think of like drug gangs in Latin America, that's kind of as representative, I think, of a cynical future as the sort of tribalism of
Yeah, not
the
not all
yeah.
tribalism. Not all tribalism has a creed necessarily. It's just
Well,
it's
exactly, right.
criminal
It's like,
criminal opportunists. Yeah.
in Brazil, you have the Comando Vermelho, right? The red command. That's not, the red doesn't symbolize socialism. It doesn't symbolize anything. It symbolizes we sell drugs for money and try to conquer as much territory as possible, And they have their symbols and they have their allegiances, and people who are part of that gang versus at least in Rio, the Terceiro, what's it fucking called? The third command of the something. Anyway, whatever, like this is the Schmittian kind of warfare, but it's not ideologically coded at all, right?
Yeah.
Well, this is a big problem I have with the Barber's thesis was the kind of the way that it's presented. Even though, yeah, I know it's more nuanced than this. It's presented in this very like Manichaean way, right? Where it's like in the end they might be a codependent relationship, but there's two big factions here. Like to me, I'm like an anti-universalist, right? Like I'm not, I very much am like always look local first before international, look regional before global. I see many different things. I see polycentrism is the term that like we like to use like at IPD when we talk about this stuff. And I don't see one globalization versus anti-globalization. I see multiple forms of globalization, probably based around tribal signifiers such as nationalism, but big country nationalism, versus like smaller forms of like anti-globalization, which also are divergent from each other. And we see this reaction too, because like when Jihad versus McWorld was written, only one big power and its alliance network were effectively exporting globalization. Well, that isn't true anymore. I mean, look at like the US loves blue jeans and it loves Facebook, whatever. Doesn't seem to love TikTok all that much, right? It's more complicated because TikTok's based in China. China is also now the world's largest industrial producer. All of a sudden, now we're allowed to have discussions about tariffs, about maybe free trade wasn't great. You have to watch influence networks. Well, these were discussions that other countries used to have about the United States, the United Kingdom, France, etc. And rightfully so, by the way. They had those discussions because they were afraid for their own sovereignty. They were afraid for how these networks could be used against them. Now the U.S. gets a taste of its own medicine. Suddenly, everyone has to 180 all the time. But I think it really just goes to show we're entering a time of multipolarity and polycentrism on the world stage. It's not going to be U.S. versus China. That's silly and reductive. China's demographic collapse is pretty real. The U.S. is obviously post-peak in so many ways. It's really proper multipolarity. There's so many different countries out there, and
I just want to
no one's going to be hegemonic. So that means multiple forms of globalization, right? There can't just be one.
Yeah. So, Christopher, you alluded or you mentioned your very quickly your institute or that you're involved in. What do you guys do there?
Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. So we're a think tank joint U.S. Canada, but we're very much like kind of counter the blob, if you will.
Sorry,
very much like trying
the Quincy Institute, a bit like the Quincy.
Yeah, similar to the Quincy Institute, but whereas they put like restraint first, realism second, we're like realism first, restraint second. So we like there are always like ways to have like a more peaceful world, and we're like you absolutely can have a more peaceful world, but like it's not always going to be like a nice sounding liberal internationalist sounding thing. Sometimes it's about sovereignty, sometimes it's just about naked interest. We're just really trying to recapture the lane for like what is a national interest, and multiple countries can have that discussion, obviously.
It was here where the call was forced to end by Google, and so we jumped out of the call and then got back in. So a minor technical difficulty there.
Hey, at least you didn't use Google Teams, because let me tell you, of all the ones I've used, that has to be the worst one.
Yeah, worse than Microsoft Teams. I've used Microsoft Teams a little bit.
Or yeah, Microsoft Teams. That's what I mean. Well, whatever. Yeah. Microsoft.
I just want to note something. Look how we slip right back into being regular liberal consumers talking about our various tools. You know, and I actually thought about that earlier when I was talking about X in Brazil. So we're talking about globalization, X is something like the new McDonald's. And my reflex when I heard about what was happening there in Brazil was like that's illiberal. And I thought about will I still be able to talk to Alex? And so I think about my cosmopolitan connections first. So the sovereignty of Brazil, or for the U.S. for that matter, was not foremost on my mind. So operation,
Mm.
I'm as much a liberal as anyone.
There are many competing interests in anything. A nuanced person, in my opinion, is not a Platonist. A nuanced person understands that everything is proportional and contextual, without going all the way and becoming postmodern, of course. But there's just universality. It's overrated. That's my view.
Yeah. Um, Speaking of
Well,
postmodern,
on the subject, I think it's interesting, right? Because we're talking about the outdated cultural reference that Barber utilizes to capture what is McWorld for him, and not just outdated cultural reference, but an overdependence on cultural references as a as a way of not just as explaining, but like as seemingly as the problem, right?
yeah,
Just a kind of an excessive culturalism. And what's interesting is that we're talking about kind of post neoliberalism and what kind of emerges out of the kind of national populist integration into the ruling order, and the kind of kind of contradictory ways that actually plays out. The cultural globalization and specifically Americanization, continues apace, and it has accelerated in recent years. And it's like that. It seems like a paradox, but I don't think it is paradoxical. I think it's just a long tail. Like the culture lags behind political and economic changes, and we'll still be living in a kind of. So I think you'll probably still get people complaining about Americanization and globalization and whatever, maybe not in those terms, long after it's like, well, but the world's moving on. It's just that the culture's kind of lagging behind. But it might take quite a long time because, what do you think the time span is if deglobalization continues until you start seeing cultural phenomena which are not just different in content but different in form, right? That like China starts pioneering not just like, oh, they do social media differently, but like something that isn't social media is something different. Or
yeah,
I don't know, cinema, which is like not just like, oh, the Chinese version of Hollywood movies, but something which is kind of very different in form.
yeah.
That would demand a kind of uh, much more kind of walled off sort of world where there'd be the space and indeed time for the kind of development and fomentation of different kind of cultural forms of cultural expression. I don't know
Yeah.
if maybe that will never happen. Maybe that will never happen again because the world is
Well,
is too interconnected now.
Well, American say,
it's gonna change slowly, right? Because like this has happened before, right? Think about the European elite long after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, speaking in Latin diplomatically for the university system, whatever.
Yeah.
And it takes like forever for them to come. Then eventually you have lingua franca, and then you have French becomes the language of diplomacy until probably World War One, shortly after World War One, and now it's English. And it's like these things. You're right; they're happening on a weird delay, but they're 100% going to come to an end. I think all of these things always come to an end.
yeah, when we think about Americanization now, it's less about McDonald's and the importation of blue jeans or TV shows. We're not talking about Ukrainians watching The Simpsons or anything. Now it's so you have an American company like Netflix, which itself hosts content from around the world. So now it's more like a cultural delivery mechanism is the thing being globalized, and that's something Mark Fisher actually talked about. Um, it- you
Oh,
know,
I've got a good example. I've got a good one on this, which I've just been watching. Sorry, but like I find it funny. Like, so you had Succession, right? And there's a type of, funnily enough, I'm not sure what, because the authority relations there are quite traditional, right? The kind of very authoritarian paterfamilias, domineering figure, which you don't get very much of nowadays. So it's kind of interesting that it's becoming it's represented in culture, at least at the levels of the elite. Anyway, So you got Succession, you got Yellowstone then, which I think comes after, at least certainly the first season comes after the first season of Succession, which is basically like, the red state version of Succession or something. I think people have called it that,
Yeah.
right? I don't think that's my term. But you get the same thing, you get a kind of wayward son, you get the one who's trying to take over, you get these internal kind of conflicts between the family and externally, and where do things fall, etc. Now one of the Netflix's number one shows across many different countries is a show called Territory, which is about cattle farmers in the Northern Territory of Australia, right? So it's literally Yellowstone except in Australia, and because it's not U.S. American, it's a little bit less sensationalist. It's a little bit
Yeah.
kind of a little bit of a slower burn and whatever, but it's basically the same. It's basically the same story. And they've gone, well, that was successful. Let's do our own version of this, and it's kind of like until we stop doing that, and I think that's a kind of a deepening of a kind of cultural Americanization than it is
Yeah. But
an
it's
opposition to it.
there are enough kind of iterations that you lose track of what the source material is, and you don't even think
Right.
it's American really, But the basic template is, comes from us. And of course the cultural liberals, the strong cultural liberals, freedom of expression will say, well, everything is basically remixed, and a lot of our stories, hey, we got it from Greek. So they'll just say, well, there's no real any kind of deleterious cultural hegemony. They were always sort of suspicious of that. I'm
Right.
growing a little more sympathetic to it, but I realize it's problematic trying to nail down any one example that is just so nefarious. Well, maybe one example isn't too difficult, but just in general, I have a hard time seeing what the problem is if I like Squid Game, Korean or um, so again, I'm in my heart, I'm a globally minded. Well, not globally minded. I consume global stuff, but I'm not globally minded. But anyway, I
Well,
just
it depends how you consume Squid Game, right? Because there's two bad ways to consume Squid Game, which are the only ways, by the way, you can consume Squid Game. I enjoyed it, by the way, but
yeah,
that's by the by. That you can either consume it the bad way, which is to take it literally and go, "Yeah, this is awesome. How would I if I competed in Squid Game? Yeah, I totally win. Oh no, maybe I'd lose, right?" So basically, missing out any critical component that the show might have, kind of social critical component of a hyper competitive and spectacularized society. The other one is to consume this critique of hyper competitive spectacularized society, and make you feel good, and then you go back to your to your usual hyper competitive life. Right?
yeah,
Those are the only two modes you can consume it, by the way, and that's the limit of
yeah.
kind
We,
of
we, we
cultural
talk about
consumption. But
hyper competition in the U.S., which I'm still not entirely sure isn't a function of a small number of would-be elites, the elite overproduction and all of that. I'm not sure a typical person really feels this anxiety over their Substack not getting as many views or in reposts as they like. It's sort of a peculiar status anxiety thing that
oh,
afflicts.
but stagnant wages and like 200 applications for two job offers
Yeah,
at
well, that's
that
that's
low wage. I mean,
understandable.
that's.
Yeah, but there's a broader thirst for a rarefied kind of fame and respect, which I'm getting at. But yeah, if it is just about stagnant wages, I think it's easier to do something about that materially. But this kind of top 10% of anything situation is always going to be hard. Because you can just give people more money. But if I get more views, in other words, relative status matters. If I get more views, but someone else got a whole bunch more, I'm still below them. And so it's a different kind of psychology behind it. But anyway,
But
that's
and it's all status. Yeah, it's all status goods, right? I mean, it's not like you
yeah,
can you can just go and feast on your followers and be happy with that. You need to
yeah.
have more
In
followers
in
than
a
the other
way,
guy.
Substack is kind of they said it's sort of like a return to blogging, but it's still just the one site that everyone gravitates to, and so it doesn't have the sense that you are a little bit of a king of a particular domain or something. You can directly see how your stats level or measure up. It's all in the same portal. You're not sort of siloed off and can tell yourself that you and the three other people you're talking to are like, that's where it's at, man. That's cool. But anyway, um, all right, I'm gonna wrap it up, you guys. Um, what time is it over there, Alex?
10 past 5.
Oh, okay. this weird idea of like 2 a.m. I don't know why.
People always have, I don't know, I think because people are like, oh yeah, South America, it's really far away. So whenever I talk to people in Europe, and I'm like, it's, it depends on the time of year because of the, like daylight savings times goes in opposite directions, but they're like, what, you're only 3 hours away, but you're so far away. I'm like,
Yeah,
yeah, because it's like vertically far away, not
yeah.
horizontally
It's the
far away.
southern
But
hemisphere thing throwing me off. It's almost like
yeah, yeah,
like on a neighboring planet,
yeah,
whereas in Europe it's
exactly.
just
Yeah.
the same planet.
Oh
Okay,
my
should
God.
should we have like a final conclusion on the book or whatever, or should
No, no.
okay, that's
All right. Oh wait.
Well,
Oh,
here's
you
one.
mean in this call,
The
like a
Gulf
final?
states, are Jihad plus McWorld, right? Already. So you've
that's
spun.
a good one. Yeah.
I misunderstood what you said. I thought you were like a follow-up call. You meant like a final statement now on Jihad versus.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah,
a good.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead if you have anything that. I guess
Yeah.
I would say one thing I thought of earlier. You mentioned Pim Fortuyn in Netherlands.
Yeah.
One thing that was odd about that kind of populism, I think more than other countries where I've seen populism become a thing, is that it's the most predicated on defending liberal values that are, in other words, not parochial. Um, so he was trying to protect women's freedoms and gay freedoms by limiting Islamic immigration. I think that's kind of a good place to be. I kind of can be on board with that. It's sort of liberalism that isn't international, liberalism that treats what you've got as something special and to be protected. But we have no pretense to shove it around everyone's or shove it around the world and down throats. Nothing like that, right?
Well, there's that strain of liberalism was much more common before like Immanuel Kant and Jean-Jacques Rousseau really took over the thing, right? Like it was very much an adaptation from sectarian strife and religious fanaticism. When you look at the kind of liberalism, and yes, it is there, despite what people think of Thomas Hobbes, of Spinoza, of people like that, it's actually like very much like you have local arrangements. Here is your local arrangement that you want to protect. Your community is a distinct community with a distinct territorial boundary. This is very much something that I'm for. Like people think because most of what I publish is in foreign policy. People think I'm really hostile to liberalism, and I'm like, I love the Bill of Rights. Like I'm a First Amendment absolutist. Like there's many aspects of me that are liberal, but I do not believe in liberal internationalism. I do not believe in it as a crusader, or shall we say, a jihadist ideology. I believe it is a arrangement, which means that there are multiple forms of liberalism or illiberalism. There's some pretty okay illiberal governments that have existed in history too. These things are situational. They're non-universal. They're localized arrangements, and that should include liberalism too. I think a mature liberalism, like the kind espoused by like John Gray today, not many people today though, is one that is like, yeah, this is like how we govern, and we have relations with other countries, no matter what their system is, based off of our interests with them. And we eschew this missionary impulse to go out and convert other people, especially because it means that we'll have to enter perpetual wars and therefore curtail freedoms at home in order to do it. And we don't want to do that.
Yeah, I've heard it described as the difference between pluralist liberalism and rationalist liberalism. And I remember reading these debates, in the 2000s, and it's arch libertarian and all that. And yeah, the pluralist libertarians were more antiwar.com readers and such.
The Gulf states are Jihad plus McWorld. You already
Yeah,
have your answer.
in fact, Boston market is huge over there, and KFC as well. They love chicken, and they're also gaining weight very rapidly in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah. All right, you guys, take care.
All right, fantastic.
All right.
Cheers. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yeah. Bye.